Modi ji has made 7 appeals to protect our economy. First, prioritize work from home. Second, avoid gold purchases. Foreign purchases to conserve fuels, so to de-expedite foods by use, to give.
Let's dive right into this explainer, because today we're unpacking something super relevant. We're looking at how our everyday, seemingly small choices are directly tied to the macroeconomic stability of an entire nation during global crises. You know, we usually think of global economics as something that happens far away in boardrooms or central banks, right? But today, we're going to see how your actual daily routine is quite literally the front line of national defense. To kick things off, we really have to ask this fascinating question. How does an everyday action, like your morning commute or just going out and buying some jewelry, actively defend or, conversely, totally drain a national currency? It sounds completely disconnected, I know, but as we'll see, when global geopolitical stress hits, the line between what you consume personally and the country's foreign exchange reserves becomes incredibly thin. So, here is our roadmap. We are going to cover the global import crisis, the 7 behavioral appeals, behavior and the deficit, the bucket theory, the political divide, and finally, nudges versus structural reforms. All right, Section 1, the global import crisis and India's vulnerability. Let's talk about the intense pressure India is facing right now, as West Asian conflicts push crude oil prices up to somewhere between $105 and $126 a barrel. These ongoing conflicts, especially around critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, have just severely shaken up global energy confidence. Now, what's really striking here is the sheer scale of the vulnerability. Think about this. India imports roughly 85 to 90% of its crude oil. That means any global instability hits the national wallet incredibly hard. And remember, crude oil isn't just another commodity. It's the absolute backbone of transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, the whole shebang. So when global prices spike by 60%, it directly and massively expands India's import bill. And wow, it is not just oil. Over 99% of India's massive gold demand is actually imported from other countries, and that requires payments in US dollars. India is one of the world's absolute largest gold consumers. We're talking about bringing in roughly 700 to 800 tons annually, while domestic production is a mere 1 to 2 tons. It's a huge imbalance. So here is the crucial point. Buying all this really expensive oil and gold widens what's known as the current account deficit. That directly drains the country's foreign exchange reserves, which recently dropped from a peak down to $691 billion. Look, when we spend more US dollars abroad than we actually earn, that gap has to be filled. You either draw down those reserves or you let the Indian rupee weaken. It's a massive, high-stakes macroeconomic stress test. Moving on to Section 2. The 7 appeals, nudging the nation. So, to combat this immense pressure, the Prime Minister did something pretty unprecedented. Instead of slamming down strict laws or rationing goods, the government turned directly to the public with these 7 appeals. This is a fascinating real-world exercise in nudge theory. The goal here is to voluntarily shift citizen consumption to protect those foreign exchange reserves without passing rigid legislation. They're asking for things like reviving pandemic-era work-from-home habits, holding off on buying gold, or maybe delaying that destination wedding. It's a strategic call for economic patriotism, trying to manage demand on the ground when the government is struggling to manage supply globally. Let's look at Section 3, behavior and the deficit. Microactions, macro impact. How exactly do these small choices add up? Well, consider who is actually on the road, with 59% of vehicles being bikes and scooters and another 37% being cars. A massive, massive portion of the population is directly tied to global crude oil prices every single day they commute to work. And this sets off a really clear mathematical chain reaction. Choosing to work from home directly leads to fewer US dollars leaving the country, which in turn helps stabilize the rupee. I mean, if an individual works from home just 2 days a week, the drop in fuel consumption might seem small for one person, but multiply that across tens of millions of households, you suddenly create significant national-level foreign exchange savings. And the numbers we're dealing with here are staggering. In the 2025-2026 fiscal year alone, India spent an all-time high of $71.98 billion on imported gold. This is exactly why there's such a strong push to hit pause on purchases. Because unlike oil, which is a productive necessity to keep things moving, gold is largely just a store of value. It's this immense outflow of dollars for an asset that doesn't immediately expand the country's actual productive capacity. Let's transition to Section 4. the bucket theory, managing the national household budget. To really demystify this whole abstract concept of a balance of payments, it helps to think of the national economy like a giant family budget. Imagine you have two buckets. Bucket one is your non-negotiable needs: crude oil, coal, fertilizers. Bucket two is deferrable wants: gold, foreign travel, luxury goods. When the price of those absolute needs in bucket one spikes, a responsible household just has to cut back on the deferrable wants in bucket two to stay solvent, right? The country physically cannot function without bucket one. The lights would literally go out. Crops would fail without fertilizers. So the government is essentially asking citizens to temporarily squeeze that second bucket. This quote we're looking at perfectly captures the reality of the situation. Whether you are importing essential industrial chemicals or taking a destination wedding in Bali, it is all draining the exact same pool of foreign exchange. And right now, that $775 billion import bill means that pool needs to be guarded for the absolute essentials. Which brings us to Section 5, the political divide, patriotism versus austerity. As you might expect, framing economic restraint as a national duty has sparked some serious debate. So the government frames this whole thing as a shared national duty, calling it smart spending to shield the economy. They insist this isn't your traditional austerity. They aren't slashing welfare programs. They're just encouraging responsible consumption. But on the flip side, the opposition strongly criticizes this approach. They see it as an unfair transfer of the economic burden right onto the shoulders of ordinary citizens. They argue that everyday people are basically being forced to lower their own aspirations just to cover up for larger policy shortcomings. For instance, critics point out that the government failed to expand strategic energy reserves over the last 12 years, keeping them completely static at 5.33 million metric tons. Plus, they warn that asking people to pause gold purchases actually threatens a massive domestic jewelry sector that employs 10 million people. And that's during a period with 15% youth unemployment. So you can see it's a really complex balancing act between macroeconomic stability and the survival of domestic industries. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, nudges v. structural reforms, buying time. It begs the question, can individual sacrifice actually solve a global energy crisis? Well, if just 25% of citizens even partially comply with these appeals, it could save an estimated $17.5 billion. Now, does that solve the crisis? No. But it vitally buys the central bank 3 to 4 months of breathing room. And in crisis macroeconomics, buying time is basically the name of the game. It stops the currency from completely collapsing while deeper, long-term fixes are put in place.
But there's a really fascinating dynamic happening here, too. While everyday citizens are being asked to pause buying gold, the Reserve Bank of India has actually been steadily accumulating 86 metric tons of gold reserves over the last 6 months. It's a deliberate strategy. The central bank is quietly securing sovereign gold to insulate against geopolitical shocks. And since their purchases typically bypass the retail dollar outflow channels, it's a very different mechanism than household consumption, even if it looks a bit contradictory on the surface.
Ultimately, though, behavioral nudges are just a bridge. To truly secure the economy long-term, these appeals have to be paired with massive structural reforms. Things like accelerating electric vehicle adoption, expanding those strategic petroleum reserves, and boosting domestic renewable energy. Because while citizen appeals might save $15 to $20 billion a year, actual structural shifts in energy and trade can save $80 to $100 billion. They really have to work hand in hand. So, I want to leave you with this final thought today. As extreme global volatility increasingly becomes the new normal, how long can citizen sacrifice alone carry the immense weight of national economic stability? It is super clear that while our daily choices hold an incredible power to shield the economy right now, the true test for the future lies in building an infrastructure that won't actually require us to make these sacrifices in the first place.